Hello, everyone. My name is Ajinkya. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester. And hello to all the disembodied philosophers listening to this. I haven't done online presentations of this kind before, so yeah, pardon any glitches. And I hope you're enjoying Switzerland. I'm kidding, of course. I'm going to speak about a deontic account of groups and group identity. And my PhD work focuses on three related areas. The first one, surprise, surprise, is groups, of course. The second one is, again, no surprise, group identification. And I use identification very specifically as opposed to group identity because I do want to make the distinction between the logical notion of identity as the conditions for two things being the same versus group identification. What I mean by identification is why and how one identifies with being part of a group. And there is a third area of concern for me, which I will not be addressing in this presentation, which is the sources of normativity. I'll probably briefly touch upon why it's important, and I'll be happy to take questions on it. But roughly, this is the idea. So, what do I mean by groups? Now, I have in mind the standard university committees, sports teams, book clubs, caste, gender, race, nationality, and so on. Now, of course, this is controversial in among some theorists because they do want to make the distinction between, say, sports teams and committees and book clubs and social kinds like gender and race. And I would try and argue that you can have a holistic account for all of them. So, previous approaches, and again, not something I will get into, just to give a brief overview. There's been meteorological approaches, the wholes and parts approach. Catherine Hawley comes to mind. There've been set theoretic approaches, structural approaches. Catherine Ritchie comes to mind, and of course, there's been performative approaches to groups and grouphood. There are two things that I want to take forward from the literature, the previous literature, two constraints that I think are very instructive in any theorizing about groups. The first is the linguistic constraint, which is to say that we have a way of using language, and we words mean things, and groups generally mean some things when they're used, when they're spoken about. And while the philosopher or the conceptual engineer has some leeway in redefining what those words mean, there are some linguistic constraints. The leeway is important for the emancipatory potential of such enterprises, but you're also ultimately tied down by um, some common linguistic community meaning, because if you go so far from that understood meaning that it loses all reference magnetism, so to speak, you will end up having a beautiful theory that probably doesn't track with how the word is used. So I think it's a useful idea to keep a linguistic constraint in mind. Again, some leeway is okay, too much is probably not a good idea. The second constraint that I think is useful in the literature is the Goldilocks constraint. This I am taking from Catherine Ritchie, of course, which is to say that any theory of groups must not undergenerate or overgenerate groups. Obviously, you don't want a theory of groups that says bands are not groups and book clubs are not groups. And at the same time, you don't want a theory of groups that overgenerates them to the point of just saying random strangers walking next to each other happen to be walking in the same direction as somehow a group. So we do not want that. We want something that constrains our account in a way that we get that happy middle. So with those preliminary comments, my account is a two-part account. The first part is an inclusion criteria. So an inclusion criteria is a necessary condition for anything to be called a group. It is the application of some criteria by which you can filter individuals in or out. Um, you apply it to some world, this criteria, and you to yield a potential collection of individuals. Now, I am saying collection of individuals, not a group of individuals, because at this point they are just that, they are collections and not groups. I will explain the difference shortly. Formally, it would look something like this. You have a function that you apply to individuals, and if they satisfy the function, they belong to collection C. Um, Collections are not groups because you can obviously come up with infinitely many inclusion criteria, inclusion functions, and not all of them will obviously be groups, because let's say you have the inclusion function of people who pour milk first and then cereal. Now, of course, you can make a collection of all these individuals, but they are not meaningfully in any way groups because they don't satisfy this next part of my account. The next part of my account is deontic enablements and curtailments. A deontic enablement is the ability to do or be something more easily than it would be without such an enablement. And a curtailment is the exact opposite. It is the ability to do or be something with more difficulty than it would be without such a curtailment. So the, these ideas might seem a bit familiar because, of course, they have appeared in various forms in the literature, not just in philosophy, even outside of it. Amartya Sen's economic ideas about human development center around doings and beings and expansions of freedoms. And I think this is an articulation of that, but perhaps that lends itself to more rigor. So the degree to which something can be an enablement or a curtailment can vary vastly. You can have something that's a minor inconvenience as a curtailment, or something that literally makes it impossible for you to do certain things, either because of legislative reasons or biological reasons, whatever. Similarly, for enablements, you could have um, something that is a minor advantage or something that is a life-altering privilege. So there is no sort of distinction between small and large advantages or smaller and larger curtailments. Uh, that's what they are. Now, how does that fit in to our inclusion criteria in potential collections of individuals? Well, groups then are potential collections of individuals that necessarily have at least one deontic enablement or curtailment by virtue of being in that collection. So, individuals in the collection, they're just collections insofar as they do not have any enablements or curtailments by being in that collection. But if those individuals necessarily face at least one enablement or curtailment that those outside of that collection would not face, then the individuals in that collection can be rightfully called groups. So that's the rough and ready picture. Now, how does this fit in with our notion of group identification? To identify with a group is to endorse one's own membership of it. This obviously doesn't always happen, which is why you could have reluctant group membership. You could have group membership that you completely disagree with. You could have group membership that you want to disavow from. But when you identify with a group, you are, in a sense, giving it your own endorsement. You want to be in that group. And what does it mean to endorse one's membership? You identify with the group when it allows you to do the things that you value. How would a group allow you to do the things that you value? And this obviously ties up with the deontic enablements and curtailments. If the things that you value become easier, which means because of the deontic enablements, then you value being part of the group. That makes things easier. If the things that you value are negative freedoms, which is you don't want to do certain things, you value not doing certain things, and being part of a group places deontic curtailments on you that keep you from doing those things, then you value being part of the group. So when what you value is aided by the deontic profile of a group, and by deontic profile I mean the sum of um, the enablements and curtailments that you face being part of the group, you identify with it. So this brings up an interesting case that I want to discuss, which is one of intersectionality. Now, you could have membership in two groups that place opposite deontic pressures on you. Let's say, let me take an example. Um, well, I am like trying this new thing by going vegan. Now, I understand that I'm playing into the trope of, oh, the vegan will always tell you they're vegan, but bear with me now. And obviously, that means that there is a deontic curtailment on me not to eat meat. But I value that, and hence I'm okay with it. At the same time, I am also I also am from a country where there's a rampant and growing food fascist movement, which means that people are lynched and literally killed on suspicions of eating beef. And obviously, I do not like that because it it politically disagrees with me significantly. So when I am in my country, I feel like I must exercise the right to eat what I want, especially consume meat, because it fights against the hegemonizing tendencies of this food fascism. So obviously, I'm in a conundrum because on the one hand, my group membership of being vegan, which is a social kind, in a sense, is asking me not to do something, and of course, my membership of being part of a political movement that is fighting for the right to choice in food consumption means that almost as a political statement, I want to eat meat, just to make sure that those rights are preserved. Now, what do? This is where it comes down to what I value more. So I'm in this weird intersectional place. Now, of course, I understand that there are more graver and intersectional claims that have greater diversity and greater gravity, but I think this example can be generalized to those as well. When you are under those competing pressures, which one do you choose depends significantly on the identity that you value more. And in my case, I realized that I value the identity of being against hegemonizing food tendencies and policies more than I value being vegan. So in those particular cases, I will, consume meat. So these answers can differ and change time to time as the things that I value change. So the reason why this sort of account works is because it brings together, of course, your classic book club examples and university committee examples, because or any institutional or formal group examples, because institutional groups or formal groups usually have a charter, a diktat, a constitution, a rule book that is essentially a list of all the deontic enablements and curtailments that are formalized within that group, and members are expected to abide by those rules. Of course, as the group evolves, there could be informal rules and so on that come into picture. But generally speaking, even those informal rules have are essentially deontic enablements and curtailments. So you take care of all of those cases, but also you take care of the social kind cases where, without essentializing, that's a key point, without essentializing what it means to be a part of some group, because I don't say anything about what the deontic profile must look like. So to be of a certain caste, or to be of a certain gender, or to be of a certain race isn't essentially tied to being in particular relations of power in society. Of course, it is true historically and contingently right now that these power relations exist, but if we were to imagine a future in which these power relations were to go away because of ameliorative exercises, because of socio-political energies, and so on, this account will still stay because it was never tied to defining social kinds as the permanently oppressed or the permanent oppressor. Even in the absence of oppression, we could think of other deontic enablements and curtailments, which aren't perhaps harmful, but just are part of the culture of being, belonging to a certain social kind, of enjoying a certain history or being subject to certain histories. So you still have a non-essentializing way of identifying, uh, social kinds such as caste, race, and gender. You obviously take care of the cases such as the book clubs and university committees and so on. And it is flexible enough to allow for things to change such that amelioration does not mean erasure, and those identities can still be spoken about meaningfully. So, and of course, there's that third component that I haven't discussed here, which is the component of sources of normativity. But I'd be happy to expand on it further, or take questions on it in the Q&A. That's pretty much it, I think. Thank you. This is my email. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or would like to discuss something further. Thank you.